Assalamu alaikum, and hello everyone. I'm your host, Henna Zaberi. Welcome back to another episode of Justice for All Now. We currently air on Muslim Network TV, on Galaxy 19, and are broadcast to the United States, Mexico, and Canada. You can also watch us on Roku TV, Amazon Fire, and soon on Apple TV. Countless wars have been perpetuated across the Middle East, time and again, and many of these conflicts seem to have lasted for oh so long. Yet, ever since the tragic events of 9/11, the Middle East has witnessed far too much war, loss, and unnecessary bloodshed. While weapons manufacturers in the arms industry keep increasing production, the United States has continuously involved itself in many trade agreements and weapons sales. This is an extremely important topic for people to understand if they are really serious about ending global wars. So, joining us today is Sanjeev Berry to discuss the militarization of the Middle East and his campaign to end US wars across the region. Sanjeev Berry is the executive director of Freedom Forward, where he works to end US alliances with dictators, kings, and apartheid systems. Freedom Forward is, a fiscally sponsored project of the Center for International Policy. Before launching Freedom Forward, Berry was Advocacy Director for the Middle East and North Africa at Amnesty International USA. Prior to his time at Amnesty, Berry served as a regional director of the American Civil Liberties Union of Northern California. He's also served as a public interest lobbyist. So I'm really excited to welcome Sanjeev and talk to him about his work with Freedom Forward, as well as the work that he's done in the past. There's just a lot of really interesting stuff that he has. He's testified before the Common Cause Commission. So I'm really excited to welcome Barry, and he's from California, and I'm from California, so that's also really exciting. So welcome. Thank you so much for being here. So tell us more about how you got involved in this. Like, when did you decide that you wanted to work for the betterment of society?
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me on the show. It's so great to be here. For me, I think like a lot of us, I was born and raised in the U.S. I'm a child of immigrants from India. My parents immigrated from India years ago, and I think like a lot of us, we hold stories within our hearts and in our minds of the history of the places that our families come from. And one of those stories is the story of South Asia and the decolonization and the pushing out of the British colonial rulers. And so I think from a very young age, I was exposed to stories about the anti-colonial movements, the freedom movements, India and Pakistan. And that sat inside me. And at some point in my high school years, I have to thank a Canadian cousin of mine from the Canadian branch of my extended family who suggested that I read some Noam Chomsky. And so in high school, I went to this local bookstore and picked up a book called Necessary Illusions, Thought Control in Democratic Societies. And that began a very long path where my awareness of what it took for people in South Asia and India and elsewhere to kick the British colonial rulers out kind of intersected with all of these difficult stories of all the dictators in the world that our own U.S. government is allied with, or even put in power, and so that's a very short answer to the story. Short answer to the question, of kind of where all of this comes from.
Okay, and so and now you're at Freedom Forward.
Right.
Tell us more about the work that Freedom Forward does. What is your specialty?
Sure. So I come from a human rights and civil rights background, and I aspire to draw lessons from the the freedom movements of the world, where communities around the world come together to put pressure on their governments and to give other people ways to stand in solidarity. So, of course, like one powerful example is the story of South Africa, and the fight against apartheid, the white supremacist system in which a white minority ruled over a non-white majority through discrimination, brutality, violence, and outright theft.
Mhm.
So that's one example. Another example for me is, of course, the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, in which Palestinians, like South Africans, are asking the world to support them in putting pressure on the companies and organizations and institutions around the world that help keep an oppressive system in place through just their day-to-day business.
Mhm.
And so anytime I tend to see dictators and repressive governments at their worst, they are kind of like mafia families, right? They use
Mm.
violence, they use oppression, they use fear for the purposes of maintaining their own privilege and expanding their wealth, engaging in corruption, all of that. So, in addition to pushing Congress and the U.S. government to change their behavior, we also can target the companies directly that
Mm.
quietly do business and make money while the Saudi monarchy, bombs, thousands of Yemenis, or while the Israeli military continues to oppress Palestinians living under U.S.-backed Israeli occupation.
So is that exact? So Freedom Forward does campaigns on. Tell us more about those campaigns. What have been some of the campaigns that you've worked for or worked on
Sure,
in their?
sure, and I think this is in the process of this work, I've learned a lot about, the kinds of campaigns that can work well. So for example, the Saudi monarchy under the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who's basically a kind of a dictator, um, they are working very hard to try to make their own behavior legitimate,
Mm.
amidst all of the controversy of how Muslim and non-Muslim women are treated by the government, of how independent Muslim scholars, who dare to imagine human rights and freedom anchored in the teachings of Islam, which of course is threatening to a dictator or a king, and the way that they've been oppressed or even killed, um, in the way that the Saudi monarchy has behaved in other ways.
Mm.
They try along the way to project this sort of aura or image of legitimacy. So
Mm.
the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, he has a kind of a fake private charity called MISC, and that charity had an event in New York City, where the New York Public Library and the United Nations were co-sponsors. It was timed to be at the same time in late 2019 as UN delegates coming from all around the world to New York.
Mhm.
And so we worked with thousands of people in the U.S. We worked with Yemenis. We worked with Saudi dissidents. We worked with people across Muslim communities, non-Muslim communities, um, to call on the UN and the New York Public Library to drop out.
Mm.
And they ultimately did. And what you're seeing here is a photo of the Saudi event after they had to move to a private location, and they still got protested. Um, so it's an example. It's an example of how we can come together to make it much more difficult for brutal governments to pretend like they can go ahead with business as usual. And then from there are other examples of the campaigns that we've run as well, and that we're running right now.
Okay. So some of the campaigns are against companies. Have you worked on campaigns against specific, like targeting governments as well? And let's start with overseas, and then we'll come to the United States.
Sure. So with governments, it's the primary government that I'm focused on is the U.S. government. But there are many governments around the world that aid and empower the Saudi monarchy. A lot of the Western governments make money selling the bombs and weapons
Mm.
that the monarchy then uses to, wage war in Yemen. against the Houthi rebels, and those bombs are dropped on civilians left and right. But so, for example, with uh, governments pushing the U.S. government, for example, to stop selling weapons to the Saudi monarchy, to the monarchy that rules the United Arab Emirates, and the other monarchies around it, because these are the governments that are using U.S. weapons to block freedom and to kill civilians. So just today, we released a letter to Congress with a number of other organizations calling on Congress to establish a full ban on U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates.
Mm. And now these two countries have also been very involved with suppressing, even the democratic movements in Egypt, in Libya, in so it spreads around the world, right? And so let's talk a little bit about that. That where what why should the United States, what is like ending what does ending alliances with non-democratic governments mean what does that really mean?
Right. It means different things for different countries. So, Saudi Arabia is America's largest arms customer, right?
Mm,
It's the largest purchaser of US weapons, billions of dollars in US weapons. And that really says a lot, right? The United States is a country that was formed out of a rebellion against British colonial rule, you know? And, fast forward over 200 years later, who are we selling as a country most of our weapons to? One of the most brutal monarchies on the planet.
mm,
So this speaks to a fundamental hypocrisy, and it's just fascinating to me the sort of blindness that can set in that justifies this. Um, so that's one example, but it's not always arms sales. So Egypt, receives about $1 billion, $1.1 billion a year in military aid. A
mm,
big chunk of the Egyptian military budget is subsidized by the U.S. And then that's also part of an arrangement where the U.S. gives even more money, $3.8 billion a year to the Israeli military.
mm,
So the Egyptian military and the current dictator, Sisi, they are incubated with U.S. power, U.S. military aid. Some of that money goes into their pockets. Some of that money goes into U.S. defense contractors' pockets. But when you're a dictator, projecting power, is one way in which you block change. And
mm.
if you're a dictator and you're backed by the most powerful country on the planet, which is the United States, that's a form of power projection.
Exactly.
Uh, you
So
know,
explain this to our audience. So for example, for us, what we see is like all these wars being fought overseas to bring democracy, for example, to Iraq or to Afghanistan. And then on the other hand, where democracies are uprising themselves, the United States is propping up dictatorship. So
yeah,
you know uh, it doesn't make sense to someone who might not understand politics. So what does this mean, and where does the this we often hear this word, the military industrial complex, that comes up. So I'd love for you to explain that to our audience.
sure, sure. I mean, I think a very safe rule of thumb is that if the US government is calling for democracy somewhere in the world, they are calling for democracy in a place that isn't where the government isn't an ally of the US, right? The call for democracy itself becomes a kind of weapon, right? It's very easy for the Trump administration and Pompeo to call for freedom in China, right? And everyone should, right? What China is doing to the Uyghur Muslim communities is horrific. It's horrific, but it's also a political tool by the U.S. government against an adversary, against a competitor, China. Meanwhile, I mean, what the Saudi monarchy is doing, what the Bahraini monarchy did, after the Arab Spring, what the UAE's warlord was trying to do in Libya, a man by the name of Haftar, who was waging a war to build another Gaddafi-style dictatorship.
Mhm.
Um, these are all behaviors by U.S. allies, and so the U.S. doesn't say anything. And I
Mm,
think that it's perhaps the original sin in all of this was that when Iranians had a prime minister, who kicked out the British controlled oil industries in Iran, the British control of oil, when in the 1950s, in the 1940s and into the 50s, I believe the U.S. overthrew Iran's democratically elected prime minister and replaced him with the king, the Shah,
The
you
shop.
know, and what would the Middle East be like today if for the past 70 years Iran had been allowed to be a democracy?
Mm,
You know, and it's almost hard to imagine, right? If it hadn't been the Shah and it hadn't then been the Ayatollah, and it hadn't been the competition between the U.S. and Iran, what would the Middle East be like today? What would Iran be like today if the U.S. hadn't overthrown Mossadegh, the prime minister, in the 1950s? So this is always the challenge. And then the last thing I'll say about Iran is Mossadegh nationalized the British Iranian holdings. He took it over, right, from the British. He said, British are getting out of here. It was called the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, right? Today, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company is called BP, British Petroleum. So the history kind of like, we forget the history, the brands change, the names change, but it's all there just under the surface.
mm. And so today, the United States consistently spends all other countries in its military and defense expenditure.
Mm-hmm.
And so over half of those weapons go out to the Middle East. So, in your opinion, what is like the steadily increasing power of this military industrial complex in the United States, and what effects does it have? Like, I've heard labor unions are involved because it brings jobs to little small towns in the United States. Um, who are all the players here?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a really important question because there are a lot of players. I mean, first, the defense sector does employ a lot of people. There are much better ways to spend that money, than the way it's being spent. If you spend $1 billion on hospitals instead of tanks, you get much more return for your investment, right?
Mm,
So the jobs the jobs issue is not, in my opinion. Yes, people are working and earning money building bombs, building tanks, and some of those bombs and tanks go to dictators after
mm,
they're built here. um, and the defense industries, they have some jobs are in this state, some jobs are in that state, and they're very good. Their lobbyists will go to a member of Congress and say, there's 200 jobs in your hometown, and then they'll go to a senator and say, we employ 1,500 people in your state.
mm,
um, and they spend a lot of money on that. So that's definitely one piece of it. But I think it's important, and there's a revolving door there. So some retired U.S. generals then become high-level executives for major defense companies. Some ex-members of Congress become lobbyists for these companies. But there's also, I think, in addition to that, a separate sort of school of thought that sees the world as a chessboard, and you
mm,
want to move your chess pieces around. And if somebody gets crushed under the chess piece, who cares?
okay.
It's Trump. President Donald Trump may be particularly bad in his corruption and his alliances with some of these governments, but at a basic level, he hasn't changed too much since what Obama was doing, right? Obama sold weapons to Saudi Arabia. Obama increased the military aid to Israel. Obama continued selling weapons to the Bahraini monarchy while Bahrainis were being, shot in the streets as they demanded freedom. And what Obama did was a continuation of the basic relationships under George W. Bush and even before that. Um, so we have a lot of work to do, but there's an important opportunity, I think, for our communities to hold our government accountable. And there's specific ways I think we can do that too.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about that in ways that we can push against this. But so one of the things that I read from one of your works that you had written about, but I was telling I really wish it was in a more mainstream newspaper or
Hmm.
someplace where people would actually read this and have more eyes on it. Is that Trump signed into law, the National Defense Authorization Act last year, which was a $738 billion bill. And the final version of this bill abandoned many of the reforms that the House Democrats had passed in their version. And not only that, um, then because of that whole focus on impeachment, uh, there was this drama playing out on the national, congressional floors, and at the end of the day, the bill that was passed was, I believe, the highest since the Iraq-Iran war, the highest days of the Iraq-Iran war. So walk us through that. Tell us what transpired, what was going on.
Yeah. So, as you said, like the annual defense bill is passed to decide how much money can be spent. And then Congress goes back and then passes another bill to actually spend the money. And, there's a House version, a Senate version, then they have to negotiate on the final version. And after the negotiations, the House and Senate pass it again, and then the president signs it. Right. So there's people who wanted a change in U.S. foreign policy, people both on the left and the right, had included some provisions in the House version, as you mentioned, that would have stopped Trump from taking military action against Iran, would have blocked U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia, penalties for the Saudis for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, and other important things as well, like preventing Trump from using or deploying small nuclear weapons, because what the world does not need is smaller nuclear weapons it's more tempting for generals to use on a battlefield. And in the final negotiations between the small number of senators and representatives who negotiated on the final version of that bill, the story is that Trump sent his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, to push hard to protect the Saudis and to push against all of these things. And ultimately, Democrats folded. They gave in on all of that, and it was a big defeat. But Nancy Pelosi spoke positively about the final defense bill. She said it was a wonderful thing for, there were some things in there that were positive, that had nothing to do with these questions of the U.S. and Saudi Arabia and U.S. wars. But overall, it was a defeat. And I think that there are a few things that are there. One really basic challenge is that in the human rights and peace community, there are not yet organizations that challenge candidates when they run for re-election. So you have environmental organizations that have a branch that does the lobbying and does the education, and then they have a separate branch that says, we oppose this candidate, we support that candidate. But peace organizations, human rights organizations, and I think I think also organizations representing the communities that are affected, Yemeni organizations, Egyptian organizations, Libyan organizations, haven't yet set up the kinds of branches that are legally allowed to spend money challenging candidates. And so that whole part of the process, when a politician is running for office or running for re-election and they decide, okay, what do I need to say in order to reduce the chance that I'll lose? That doesn't apply to our community yet, right? So they're not afraid of losing because of us. And so
challenge. So what does that mean? Actually running a candidate against them, or
could be,
or town halls, challenging them at town halls. What is challenging like?
So I think the best example is what the pro-Israel lobbying organizations are thought to do, right? Which is that they have groups that lobby, they have groups that educate on their perspective. If you want to call it education, you can call it propaganda. And then they have networks that raise money. They have networks that support some politicians and oppose others. And a lot of politicians are just sort of trained to think that's one issue I shouldn't talk about because I might not get reelected. We don't have anything like that, right? And you don't necessarily, in my opinion, you don't have to spend millions of dollars to do it. Simply having somebody show up in an election and say, I'm running against this person because they betrayed us, is enough to start to scare politicians and change how they behave and what they decide to fight for and drop in these negotiations in Washington, D.C.
Interesting. So maybe having a Rohingya former refugee running against Mitch McConnell because he won't let that bill pass.
Right.
So even though there's no chances of winning per se, but just having somebody challenge you at that level. Interesting.
but I would say that like in a lot of races it'd be very difficult to win. But one thing to remember is like how many times has Nancy Pelosi gone from being the opposition to the speaker to the opposition to the speaker, and every time that happens, it's because a number of Democrats win and lose in
Mm,
what are called swing districts, right? They're so close to each other, the number of Democrats and Republican voters, that they swing back and forth. And so in that environment, 1 or 2 or 3 or 4% of the vote makes a big difference. And if enough races that are swing races, 1 or 2 or 3% change, then the leadership of both parties comes in and out of power in
mm,
Congress. And so I actually think that like there is a world of work to be done that could actually make a huge amount of difference because suddenly the leaders of the US Congress would be worried about whether they're going to stay in power if
mm.
they don't have our 2% or 3% or 4% of the vote.
Exactly. Like Northern Virginia is
Right,
that,
exactly.
or Ohio, or places like that. That is
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
this is and this is a tactic that some, especially those who are concerned about human rights, need to be focused on, because even with this Democratic primary, that was one of the shifts that we were trying to make, was questioning and having some of these candidates put human rights on their platforms. Elizabeth Warren, um, even Biden, a lot of them, like they talk, they'll go up there
Yeah.
and talk the talk, but it's not on their official platforms. So, and I feel like a lot of times, because, and this can relate back to some of your work at Amnesty, I asked this of some Amnesty leadership when at their last conference, is a lot of times Amnesty in the United States hasn't looked at the United States as a human rights um, culprit.
Mhm.
We talk about civil rights here, and so. I don't know if you would. I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure. I think when I was the Middle East director for Amnesty International USA in Washington D.C. from 2011 to 2017, and that was a very painful time because the Arab Spring revolutions were all underway, and then in different ways, different governments were crushing them. Except for Tunisia, where it was a success.
Mhm.
And I certainly worked very hard to push Congress, push the White House on cutting off the arms sales
Mhm.
and that. And people during that time also Amnesty International USA staff were increasingly focused on domestic issues inside the US. So I went with teammates to Ferguson, you
Mhm.
know, um, to monitor the human rights situation there after the killing of a black man in the streets of Ferguson by the police. Um, and so that shift has happened over the last decade. But I think what is still missing is just as our collective community, doesn't have strong enough uh, organizations for the political battle in elections, we also haven't yet developed the grassroots networks to challenge the policies yet. And what I mean by that is um, human rights organizations are very good at saying, here's the problem, here's the solution, and here's the analysis, and here's what's happening, right? These people are in this Egyptian prison. Morsi Morsi is at risk of death if he does not get health care, and then sadly he died because the Egyptian government wanted him to die. Um, but what's missing then is the kind of strong network um, from within the community, whether it's Egyptians or Syrians or others, who have have a chance to use the kind of strategy that South Africans used,
Mhm.
like or that Palestinians are using with boycott, divestment, sanctions, so such that the broader society and government has to pay attention, right?
Yeah, we don't
Um,
have that Act for America kind of picnic, in the churches, in that that's
yeah,
like that's why they're so successful, even though with all their hate and everything is like, you look at their model and how they were able to convert entire towns over to their line of thinking, and it is that super grassroots, and definitely. So continue your thought, and then I want to ask you about what, we talked a little bit about earlier, generational learning in
Sure.
activism, and
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so I guess the last thing I would say on that is uh, I think that the challenge is just getting the campaigns going. And I'd love to talk to folks who are watching right now. Feel free to, I mean, my Twitter account is my first name, last name on Twitter. And I'd love to stay in touch with people because the people who are watching us talking right now are the ones who have the power to build those networks. But I mean, I would just say this, like, I think if you go to your average American voter and you say, do you think you should be giving, $10 a year to the Israeli military? Most people are going to say no. Do you think you should be giving $3 or $4 a year to the Egyptian military? Most people will probably say no. Um, and they just don't yet have an effective place to go, right? To say, I want my money back. Yes, there are some people who are going to say, no, I want my money to go there. But a lot of people are going to say no. Like, why should my money go over there? So that's one piece of it. The other piece of it is like that the anti-apartheid, the South Africa movement, the Palestinian BDS movement, you take a look at the horrifying trajectory of what happened in Syria, right? And the Assad dictatorship was protected by the Russian sort of a dictator, Putin. Meanwhile, Putin was selling and is selling lots and lots of oil and energy to, I don't actually know if it's oil or natural gas, but to Europe. So if you think back to that time when people all around the world were saying, what should we do about the refugees? How can we help? What should we do? That would have been the time to say, all these governments need to block Russian energy exports until Russia stops protecting Assad. And then I guarantee, I bet for sure that the Russian government would start to see what would happen against their energy exports as a national security threat. So we have these opportunities are happening all the time, and we just need the networks to mobilize around them. We need people.
So, but how do you make, so what we do see these large like platforms like change.org and move on, so
Yeah.
people sign a petition and then they think they're done, right?
Yeah.
How do we get beyond these petitions and actually, so if I do make a call, if I do am invested and I do spare that 2 minutes of my time, which is all usually people tend to give to these sort of things, how do we make their 2 minutes go further?
I think that what we need is a triangle to be kind of built, and that triangle is 3 points, at least three. Maybe it's a square. I don't know. I can think of a triangle right now, so we'll start with a triangle. Maybe it'll become a hexagon by the time I'm done. But it's those who have the time and the energy to take action but aren't sure what to do. Folks like me who have devoted our careers to the strategy of it, and then people in the community who have the wealth and resources to turn the strategy into reality. I mean, what we want is 10,000 or 100,000 people taking action, maybe 100 people like me, involved full time, and then a lot of people who have the money and wealth funding 100 people like me to be working with 10,000 or 100,000 people. So with any of these issues, right, you can build a campaign where suddenly lots of people are saying, why is my money going to this dictator in Egypt? And then once you get it far enough, you'll have somebody in Congress say, okay, let's cut the funding. And then suddenly the Egyptian dictatorship will say, oh, we need to release some people from prison right now. Otherwise, we could lose our funding. We need to do something to undermine their campaign, and so that's the triangle. People in the community who have the wealth and resources investing in the strategists and campaigners who then work with tens or hundreds of thousands of people. So it's not just a petition, but it's actually a strategic campaign that members of Congress, that politicians, that the media all can't ignore.
And that is true. That a lot of us are doing this work, but then we work in silos and we don't sort of collaborate. And even though the end result, for example, right now in June, that's when Congress is going to decide how much military aid they're going to, or exchanges they're going to do with Burma.
Right.
And yet, has the Burma Task Force had those conversations with you to say, hey, what could we have done to stop any more aid, any
Yeah.
more
Yeah.
weapons going into Burma? Or not just Burma, there's so many other Burmese organizations who are, Shan, Kitchen, Karen people who have a lot of, those are the largest refugee communities in the United States, but yet how to mobilize them, how to educate them. So this is something that we're talking about. Like a lot of the, now as we look at the Palestinian movement and with Jewish Voices of Peace, and a lot of like work had that, but it took a long time to get here. How can we shorten this amount of time that
Yeah.
people, are learning how to, how to work this system?
Yeah. Yeah. This is, I think, the most important point because, like as I see it, um, people leave their countries of origin, whether it's my parents leaving India or, other folks leaving other parts of the world. They come to the United States. Maybe they are escaping something. Maybe they're just looking for better opportunities, or maybe the better opportunities they're looking for are the consequence of a corrupt dictator who has taken all of the money out of the economy. So they're dealing with poverty back home. Um, and then sometimes it's a generation, right? Where they live in the country, and sometimes there's a particular cruelty to it, where the country they come to is the United States, which is funding the problem back home. And a lot of time goes by, right? Like the original Palestinian refugees were displaced in the 40s. The original Nakba was in the 40s. My understanding is the BDS movement, the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions movement, launched in the early 2000s.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a lot of time. That's several generations. And so what I think we need to do is we need to compress that multi-generational cycle into 5 years or 2 years. And the way we do that is just as there are major organizations like Amnesty International that quickly produce the the analysis and the reporting and the recommendations. We also need an organization like that quickly brings in communities into the strategies for how you get out in the streets, how you lobby Congress, how you mobilize within your community to be effective. Because I've seen too many times that the path for learning is so slow that windows open up and then they close again. You
Mm-hmm.
know, Mubarak is thrown out of office, and there's a window, and some people take different approaches, and then the window closes again, and CC is back. You know, uh, or CC is there, right? So we have to close. We have to close that. We have to collapse that cycle of learning into a very short period of time, because we're going to continue to see these opportunities. You can call them opportunities. You can call them cracks or fault lines. Like as climate change continues, as the world becomes more challenging and more difficult, I personally believe there are going to be more revolutions. There's going to be more change moments, and those can go well or badly. And and we collectively, ought to be working together now to prepare ourselves to accelerate the campaigns when those openings come back up.
So I have a question for you. So
Mhm.
you do work with ending alliances with non-democratic. What happens when democratic partners of the United States, um, who also buy a lot of weapons? For example, right now India.
Yeah,
Talking about India.
yeah,
India has been buying a lot of weapons from the United States as well as other Israel, a lot of other places, and increasingly we're seeing the use of their weapons against their own people.
yeah.
So what what happens then? Like where is where's that trajectory going?
Yeah. I mean, I think a couple of things. One, if you imagined a large community of Muslim and Muslim allies and allies of Muslims in the United States working together, you know, at a level that is even bigger than the current work that's being done
Mhm.
on Rohingya issues, on Uyghur issues, on freedom from the Sisi dictatorship, on Palestinian freedom, and then also on Kashmiri freedom, and on an end to discrimination against Muslims in India. Um, and then you can start to imagine like a pretty robust kind of network that is built on forward momentum, as opposed to exhaustion or as opposed to sadness or fatigue. So that's one thing. Like we have to do that work of creating the system through which we quickly mobilize together in a very powerful way. And then Congress will pay attention once they feel heat, right? But they don't feel enough heat for those arms sales. That's one thing. The other thing is it goes back to the anti-apartheid or BDS stuff. And what I mean by that is, there are some major industrialist families in India, right? There's the Tata family. There is the Ambani family, the Mohinder family, right? These are big, big industrial families that are multi-billion-dollar families. They all speak positively of Modi, India's prime minister, who is anti-Muslim and, basically has Hindu fascist visions. They speak positively of him. And then meanwhile, Tata Consulting works with Fortune 500 companies in the US, right? The billionaire families have their businesses in the West and in India, and they say what they want to say in India. So that's a campaign. I look at that and I say that's a campaign waiting to happen because the American economy is weak. Nobody wants negative press for their business. You could just quickly go and say, you could say to one of these families, we want you to oppose what Modi's doing, or we're going to campaign against you in the US, in Germany, in Britain, in all of the economies where you want to make money. And then you go do it, And if the Tata Consulting operation or some other Indian industrialist family, is seen as a threat to the business interests of some company in the United States, in this environment, American companies don't have any investment in Hindu fascism, right? Like, what does Ford Motors care, right? They will just do this. They'll say, we're getting all this pressure. We're not going to work with you as a consulting firm this round. So the same process for targeting Russian energy exports to Europe because of their behavior in Syria, or Israeli companies, or U.S. military aid to Egypt is the same campaign, for targeting the wealthy sectors of India that uphold the Modi government with all of the dark money that flows in Indian politics, right? We just have to build the system to do it. So we need another 50 people like me and another 1,000 people like you and another 100,000 people, that are already out there wanting to do something, right? Like so many people are talking about what the Modi government's doing in India. People just need a plan, and we can build that plan once we have the resources we need collectively to do it.
So going back to Saudi Arabia, so the United Nations Secretary General just took Saudi Arabia off their list of shame. What was your reaction to that? And what are some of the current campaigns that you'd like, that Freedom Forward is working on that you'd like our audience to get involved in?
Sure. It's absolutely ridiculous. The Saudi monarchy has killed countless children. They bombed school buses. They bombed, mosques and hospitals. They've killed countless children. It's unbelievable to me that the UN Secretary General would take the Saudi dictatorship off the list of governments that are killing kids. There's no justification for that. And I have to wonder what's happening behind the scenes. The United Nations is as imperfect as the world it draws from. And, you have to wonder, like, what sort of pressure was being brought to bear on the UN from behind the scenes. So that's my feeling about that. If for folks who want to help change the Saudi monarchy's behavior towards Muslim, Arab, and non-Muslim and non-Arab communities, I think Muslim communities are probably the biggest victims of the Saudi monarchy's bloodshed and violence, by virtue of the number of people whose democratic desires get stopped, who get bombed in Yemen, who get shut down in Bahrain, who have to deal with the warlord, trying to get power in Libya. One important focus is the Saudi monarchy's desire to make money off its money. And the way it wants to make money off its money is off of something called PIF, the Public Investment Fund, which is their sovereign wealth fund. It's the bank account for the Saudi monarchy that owns 5% of Uber, that has money in Slack, that has money in other companies. The Saudi monarchy has a seat on the Uber board of directors. The head of the Public Investment Fund is on the Uber board of directors. And this is important because right now, the Saudi dictator, Mohammed bin Salman, wants to build a city, a hyper modern future city called Neom, and he is destroying a tribal community to do it. You know,
Mm,
they may not have the money to actually build the city, but they've already killed a prominent tribal leader of the Al Huwaitat tribal community, and they're pushing to destroy thousands of homes. And this whole project is owned by and run by the same public investment fund that invests in Uber. So there's an opportunity right now to connect the dots and say, no one should take Saudi money. And if you take Saudi money, I'm not going to give you my money, you know,
mm,
and to start to build that kind of pressure. Saudi Arabia is the president of the G20 this year, the gathering of the world's wealthiest nations. And so they're trying to use that to appear as glamorous and legitimate and leader like as they can, right? And our opportunity is to say, no, this is a brutal dictatorship. No one should go to that G20. No business should go and shake hands there. If you
mm,
do, we're going to call you out. No organization should participate. And companies that take Saudi money are going to face criticism and boycotts from us.
mm,
Um, so it's essentially the same model, right? Like we have the power of going after the brand of a company. And what you're seeing right now is a part of this, which is that among the different groups that go to the G20 is something called the W20, which is
mm,
the Women 20. And these are women entrepreneurs and professionals, and in some cases, human rights advocates from different countries. So they're going to the Saudi-led G20. They have an agenda. Their agenda doesn't say anything about the Saudi monarchy's imprisonment of Saudi women who
mm,
wanted the freedom to drive, right? Lujain al Hathlul is one of several Saudi women who campaigned for an end to the guardianship system in which adult women have to have the permission of men to do all kinds of things in their lives. Um, she's sitting in prison right now. She's been tortured, and the W20 has said nothing about this, right? So
mm,
this is the way in which propaganda works and power works. The Saudi monarchy wants to benefit from the image of convening women leaders from around the world, even as it imprisons women leaders inside the country who dare to speak out. We have the ability to call on the W20 delegates to drop out. And between now and November, when the G20 happens, we're going to start putting pressure. I mean, what you're seeing right now is a letter that a lot of organizations already signed. So the
mm.
delegates know there are several of them in the United States, and we're going to start turning up the heat so that no one can go to Saudi Arabia, you know, pretend to be an advocate for women's issues and then stay silent on the horrific treatment of brave Saudi women who dared to ask the question of how they should be treated.
True. So, and so one thing that I did want to say is that so the militarization and the complicated history that the U.S. has had is not just limited to the Middle East, right? Like we've seen a lot of now investment and just this dark, heavy history of America's relationship with the continent of Africa and many African countries.
Yeah.
So, and this is, as we're wrapping up the show, that's something that I would, especially in the current climate, how do you think this, the current climate of Black Lives Movement affects the United States relationship with, a lot of like the African Union Commission has said that the Pan-African body rejects the continuing, the practices of against Black citizens of the United States. So it's just fascinating to see like how much military investment is being made in Africa, and then this pushback as well.
Yeah, so there's this sort of two sides of one coin of brutality against Black populations and communities inside the United States and outside the United States. Inside the United States, police forces are basically, built to suppress and control Black communities and receive weapons from the U.S. military. The U.S. military has a surplus military program where it gives old U.S. military weapons to American police, which then turn those weapons on people who are protesting, on people who demand not to have all of their city money going into a police department that polices itself, which means it doesn't do anything. And then the other side of that coin, as you mentioned, is the militarization U.S. policy everywhere, right, including in Africa, where there are thousands of troops now, U.S. troops in Africa operating without public oversight. Thousands of Africans, I believe thousands of Somalis have been killed through drone strikes. The U.S. military claims that they were all quote unquote militants, but just as we shouldn't trust American police to police themselves, we shouldn't trust any military to police itself, right? There may well be hundreds, if not thousands, of dead civilians as a result of U.S. drone strikes across sub-Saharan Africa, and this isn't something that's new, right? I mean, even going back to the South Africa anti-apartheid movement, Ronald Reagan wanted to maintain the relationship with the white supremacist government of South Africa, and it took a broad public movement to challenge that. There's an excellent piece by the executive director of the Center for International Policy. His name is Sally Booker. The Center for International Policy is a fiscal sponsor for Freedom Forward. They handle some of our finances. And Sally Booker has written a piece on how, this sort of white supremacy and question of Black Lives Mattering, extends to Africa and U.S. military policy there. So I encourage people to go to foreignpolicy.com and look up that piece on the question of Black Lives Mattering, and the brutality of U.S. foreign policy across Africa.
Well, thank you so much, Sanjeev, for this incredibly informative discussion. You've presented some, really solid strategies that perhaps we ourselves at Justice for All should be taking a look at. And I look forward to some off-screen discussions with you on that. And thank you to all of our audience members for tuning in today. Be sure to watch Muslim Network TV on Galaxy 19 and Muslim Network TV, muslimnetwork.tv. We will see you tomorrow. Assalamu alaikum.